Hello, everyone. My name is Guy Charlton, and I'm teaching American Constitutional Law and Policy, Law 396, LLM 599. This is a discussion that we've had with that class regarding the American elections. And so, as part of that course, given the timing of this election, we decided to do a session on elections and voting rights in this. And so I'll be talking about that for the next 40 minutes to an hour. And if you have any questions regarding the election, please contact me, Guy Charlt at GCHARLT3 at une.ac.edu.au. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk firstly about the right to vote as a fundamental right in the United States. This is something that when you read the press, you come away with different notions. We're going to have an overview of the elections. We're going to talk about the road to electoral office, including money and the elections, and then we're going to talk about the 2020 presidential election. So just generally American elections, and you can probably tell from my accent, I grew up in the United States, and the differences in American elections are from other liberal democratic states are fairly profound. The first thing is that in the United States, at the state and local level, as well as there are numerous elections, many times in my own home state, which we're going to talk about a little bit in this lecture, Wisconsin. There's local elections and state elections both in April and then again in November. So each year, American citizens are required to go out and vote. Of course, many of them don't vote. Unlike here in Australia, there's no requirement that you vote. The second notion is that there are multiple offices at the state and local level. So the voting here in Australia, the offices are generally legislative positions, where in the United States there are many offices: district attorney, judge, town treasurer, register of the deeds, coroner. Lots of particular offices are also up for election. And the idea of this, of course, is to create more accountability to the public. The next notion about American elections, and we'll see this in other jurisdictions as well, is there's quite a few referendums, and there is direct democracy in many states. So most prominently, these referendums at the international level, you hear about California. For instance, they'll have a referendum on property taxes or same-sex marriage. These referendums are controlled by state constitutions, and in some instances they are binding, in some instances they are not binding. For instance, in the November election in Wisconsin, there is an issue about whether or not the voters would like to see marijuana decriminalized. The other notions of some other things is that these elections are taking place in an increasingly polarized political environment. The polarization of the electorate between left and right, between the Democrats and the Republicans, have been heightened over the last several decades, and in particular during the term of current President Donald Trump. Most elections in the United States are at the national level, and now increasingly at the state and local level, are expensive. So the restrictions, governmental restrictions for spending, there's restrictions on contributions, but there's little restrictions on expenditures. These campaigns are getting increasingly expensive, particularly with the use of buying television time and ads on the internet. Most elections, in fact, all elections at the national level, are first past the post, meaning the person who wins the most electorate votes in that particular district wins the district, whether or not they win 50% of the vote. And so this first past the post system favors two-party umbrella systems, umbrella parties, because you need to aggregate votes to win elections. The next thing that's different from many other jurisdictions is that voting rules, specific voting rules, differ from state to state. While you have a fundamental right to vote in the United States, the actual implementation of that right in light of the local circumstances is done within the context of state law. And as these rules differ from state to state, you'll see in the next, and you have seen in the popular media over the last few months, lots of litigation, state and federal litigation regarding restrictions or expansion of people's ability to vote and to register to vote. The other notion to remember in light of that, these cases of court cases that you've been seeing in the popular press, is that historically the right to vote has been restricted. That in fact there's been property restrictions, there's been restrictions based on your gender, there's been restrictions, poll taxes, taxes for you to pay polls, and many of these restricted franchise devices have been adopted by other states seeking to restrict the right to vote. And of course the overall trend in the American polity is to increase the right to vote. So what you're seeing today in today's presidential election is you're seeing a concerted effort by certain political groups and political parties to restrict the right to vote with a pushback on the other side. And because of the notion of these fundamental rights and the fact that states actually, state law actually governs particular voting practices, you will see these constitutional rules, right to vote, interpreted in a state context. And to many extents, the law regarding voting rights in the United States continues to develop over time. So the first thing I want to talk about is the constitutional provisions related to the right to vote. You do have voting is a fundamental right to vote in the United States. And you can see this by looking at various provisions in the Constitution itself. 15th Amendment, eliminating restrictions on the right to vote on account of race. The 19th Amendment last year, giving women the right to vote. The 24th Amendment relating to the election of both the president and the vice president. And the 26th Amendment giving the individuals who are 18 and over the right to vote. There's also, besides these textual notions of the right to vote, there's also non-textual rights found under the Equal Protection Clause. And you can see that the court, in interpreting these provisions in Kramer and in Reynolds versus Sims, has said that the right to vote is a fundamental right that is protected under the Equal Protection Clause, not only against restrictions that may be even placed by the federal government, but by the states. So the federal Constitution under the 14th Amendment is applied to the states, and that is why you will see federal courts as well as state courts opine on particular voting issues during this electoral period. And the interesting thing about voting, of course, is that voting is not just a fundamental right in and of itself. It is fundamental because all other rights arise from this right to voting and this right to a republican form of government as it's set forth in the American Constitution, and that this voting right is also a form of expression. So you will see courts approach the issue of voting and restrictions on spending, for instance, in the context of elections, as a form of expression. And there's a few fundamental rules related to this fundamental right. The first one that we need to be aware of is that it is Baker versus Carr. It's the one person, one vote principle, which means that, of course, we've seen it here in Australia and in other jurisdictions where various voting districts are represented, have considerably less population than other districts, rural versus urban. And what we have in the United States is you have a constitutional mandate that restrictions on the size, on the population of voting districts needs to follow the one person, one vote principle. And then the notion is that because if you don't have equal, similar size voting districts, it's malapportionment and it's unconstitutional. Now, there are restrictions on voting rights, as we've seen daily, if you're paying attention to the American press, and these issues bubble up into the international circumstances. There are restrictions on voting rights in the United States, as there are in other jurisdictions. The first relate to laws that deny citizens the right to vote. For instance, felons and prisoners. There's a particularly bitter dispute going on in Florida, where a popular referendum overturned the restrictions on voting rights for felons, and then the state legislature was able to move around that popular referendum by requiring that these convicted felons need to pay off whatever fines they owe to the state in order to vote. This was upheld by the Court of Appeal recently in the face of vehement criticism that it's a poll tax, meaning that it's a tax on your right to vote, which is considered unconstitutional. Then there are governmental actions to dilute voting power, for instance, Baker versus Carr, and gerrymandering. And then there are laws that limit the ability of candidates and parties to access the ballot. Now, we're not going to go into those, but if you look at the disputes that are going on in the current election cycle, they relate to all three of these sorts of restrictions. The one I do want to talk about fairly in depth is the issue of gerrymandering. And here's in this slide, this is the first gerrymander named after Governor Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts in the late 17th century. The 18th century. Eldridge Gerry drew lines in order to encourage his re-election for him and his party, and it was accused of looking like a salamander. Therefore, the term gerrymandering came out. And here's some examples of gerrymandered districts. So the gerrymandering at the state level can be quite extensive and have significant impacts on the vote. I'll use my home state, Wisconsin. Now, why do you get gerrymandering? Because the state legislatures are empowered to draw the district boundaries. And of course, there is always self-interest to draw those boundaries in such a way that you maximize your ability to win seats. And this ability has become more effective over time. This with the use of computer data, voting data, which can make this gerrymandering and district boundaries drawing more and more effective to achieve your preferred results. Now, in Wisconsin, the state was, after the last census, and the census occurs every 10 years, and it's occurring now, just wrapping up in the United States, the state is required at that time to redraw the district boundaries to effectively address the issues of malapportionment in one person, one vote, one person. So this process is happening every 10 years across all the states. Of course, that doesn't prevent the state, for instance, Texas, from going afterwards and then redrawing the boundaries again. But you can see the difficulty with gerrymandering and the self-interest involved. Many states have independent commissions. They submit to the legislature. There's been a normative sort of environment where gerrymandering is done, but it's not done in such a way that's overtly political and overtly unfair. Of course, this has changed also in the last over the last several decades. So here's Wisconsin. Wisconsin was recently, the Supreme Court recently held that this doesn't while it may offend the Constitution, it's a political question, and therefore the Supreme Court, the federal courts, don't have the ability to intercede in these disputes, even though I think the court will revisit it. Wisconsin, heavily gerrymandered, used two terms: cracking, dividing state party supporters into multiple districts, and then packing, putting them all in so there's a supermajority within that. And you can see the difference in terms of blue and red districts in Wisconsin. And the effect of this gerrymander is that in 2018, Republicans won 46% of the vote in Wisconsin, but 64% of the assembly seats. And similarly, in Texas, you have gerrymandering, and what was considered to be a spectacular gerrymander at the federal level, where the state legislature redrew the federal districts such that it would entrench Republican power at the congressional district level for the next 10 years. And you can see the results. The presidential election in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump, Republican Democrat, by 9 points, yet the House result at the federal level was the Republicans won 69% of the House. And you can see over on the one slide the extensive districts that have been redrawn, basically parceling out the city of Austin, heavily Democratic city. And in relation to these federal gerrymanders and state gerrymanders, as I said, the Supreme Court recently said that it is a political question. The courts will not get involved by a 5-4 vote. Now, there is, of course, legal gerrymandering under the Voting Rights Act, and you can see the 7th District of the state of North Carolina, where, of course, states would draw boundaries to disenfranchise African Americans, and so the federal courts will oversee the ability of states to draw districts that would disenfranchise racial minorities. And as you can see, it's the 9th district. I'm sorry, the district has been drawn in such a way to allow for a minority candidate to be elected. Okay, overview of state elections real quickly. The state elections which are occurring right now on November 3rd, you'll have gubernatorial elections, you'll have state House of Representatives, you'll have state Senate, you'll have state judiciary, you'll have constitutional amendments, and you'll have referendums. Now, the states differ in terms of when they hold, how many elections they hold, how many seats are up, what judicial districts are, what cards are judges are elected, which are not. These are all different. They're all relatively the same in terms of how their organizational structure is, but their voting patterns change and vary by state law. And of course, one needs to remember that there are also local elections that will be going on. So, for instance, my hometown of Milwaukee will have vote for city supervisors or city judges in these issues, district attorneys who oversee the prosecution of the law, etc. So on the national level, you of course have presidential elections every 4 years. This is the last election being 2016, now 2020. You have congressional elections every 2 years. The congressional elections are for the entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate. And the U.S. Constitution sets forth the basic rules for federal elections. And you can see that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time make or alter such regulations except in the places of choosing senators. So the Congress can, under the Constitution, set national rules, and of course the courts can oversee these state rules based on congressional on constitutional amendments, as well as the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment. But Congress, in many circumstances, has chosen not to do those. They've legislated when the election is and some other requirements for the elections, but not all of them. And that's where you'll see the disputes that are going on right now. And as I said, the elections right now, 2 years for the entire House of Representatives, 435 seats. The Democratic Party, which currently holds a majority in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the Democratic Party in the House, are expected to win a majority again. And then, of course, there's the U.S. Senate. Senators have a 6-year term. It is elected directly at an at-large district for the state. And every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate seats are up, and that map shows you where the elections are right now. The current election cycle that the Republicans are defending, 21 seats, Republican senators are up for re-election versus the 12 for the Democratic Party. So all things being equal, this cycle, the Republicans are on defense. The Democrats have less seats at risk. And you can see that, of course, the Senate election is becoming increasingly close because given the state of the polls, there could be a move. The Democrats are within striking distance of taking over the U.S. Senate. So what are the constituency boundaries? Well, effectively, each representative, because there's 435 seats in the House of Representatives, each constituency is approximately 650 to 700,000 persons for each representative. And of course, the U.S. Senate has 2 senators for each state for a total of 100 states. And of course, in event of a tie, the vice president has a vote in the Senate. So if it's 50-50, Michael Pence, the current vice president, will have the tie-breaking vote. Now, of course, if you look at the way the American Constitution establishes state representation in the Senate or at-large districts within the Senate versus the House, and the fact that the House is limited to 435 members. It hasn't been raised since, I believe, 1921, though Congress can increase the size anytime it wants. So unlike many jurisdictions where the size of the legislature simply increases with with population growth, in fact, the Congress has to change it. And the other rule is that each state has to have at least one district. So in the United States, on the coast, you have large states with large populations. And in many states in the middle part of the country, in the Great Plains, have very small populations, yet they're entitled to 1 representative and 2 senators. So you have a disparity of votes in people in California, for instance, there's 50, actually that's incorrect, it's 55 seats in the House, 2 seats in the Senate for up to 40 million people, and where you have North Dakota is 1 seat in the House of Representatives and 2 senators. So there's vast disproportionality between the amount of people represented by individual districts. Now, candidate requirements, obviously you have the formal legal requirements that you must meet, but essentially to be effective in an American election, you need organizational support, you need party support, and you need local group support. You need name recognition, state and local. This is where publicity, advertisements move in. You also need the human touch at the local level. One of the things that Joe Biden has been seen as an effective campaigner because of his personal tragedy in his life. He has empathy. And then, of course, you need resources you need money, you need volunteers, you need resources to get your name out into the electorate. So the one of the significant and troubling issues with American elections has become the use of money. Now, money has always been a factor in American elections. The trend in because of less organizational support by parties, the sort of personification of the electoral cycle. You see this in Australia. You don't just vote for the Liberals, you vote for Scott Morrison. The importance of electronic and television media, internet media for publicity has increased the demand for money. But of course, this use of money can have troubling impacts. In the United States, we've seen a proliferation of political action committees that bundle campaign contributions together and then spend them. This also includes super PACs. The Supreme Court has restricted the ability of the federal and state governments to restrict campaign expenditures and campaign contributions. So as a result of this, there is skyrocketing costs to campaigns. This will be the most significantly most expensive campaign in the history of the United States. And of course, this emphasis on money in elections means that candidates have to spend more time raising money. Instead of campaigning, seeking votes, they need to raise money. And as attached to this slide is a recent story from the New York Times about Joe Biden using going to raise money from significant large donors. And this, of course, leads to the question of inequalities in political influence. The fact is you can go out and mom and the mom and pop can donate $50 or $100 to the candidate of their choice, yet their interests are not as privileged within the candidate's decision-making process as these large donors. These inequalities due to campaign expenditures and campaign donations. And then finally, of course, there's issues of corruption, straight-out corruption with large uses of money. And as I said, the cost of the election cycle here is predicted to be $10.8 billion. And most of which, a large percentage of which is the presidential election, but this includes also at the state level and at the local level. And you've seen records spent, the Georgia Senate elections, record amount spent, the North Carolina Senate elections, records amount spent, Iowa, Maine. You're seeing an increasing amount of money spent outside of the state, which is related to the increased cost and use of advertisement by candidates and independent groups within particular jurisdictions. So when we're talking about money in elections, there's four ways that money can affect elections and that individuals can contribute. There's individual contributions. There's political action committees and what's called super PACs. There's party contributions. You give money to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party then uses that to support candidates. And then there's independent advertisements. Now, we don't need to go into this slide in many particular detail, but notice that at the individual level for super PACs, which are a particular type of campaign entity, the contribution limits are unlimited. And so this is one of the basic mechanisms in which the cost of campaigns have gone up. And of course, there's restrictions on the use of money by super PACs. However, the use of money has been severely, the ability of the government to regulate the campaign expenditures has been cut back most recently by the Citizens United case versus the Federal Election Commission in 2010. And in this case, by a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that campaign expenditures were a component of free speech. Money equals speech. And to the extent that there is a relationship between money and speech, the court has eliminated all restrictions, or most of the restrictions, that the government can place on the campaign expenditures, particularly in that super PAC categories. And they do, of course, in the United States, continue to have campaign laws, which if you voluntarily accept governmental money, you then in turn your expenditures are restricted. These, given the increased cost of campaigns, has become less and less a factor in state and federal elections. So this is an issue that was criticized by President Obama in his State of the Union speech in 2010, and in it again, given the composition of the court, is unlikely to be rolled back in the near future. However, you can trace a lot of the increase in campaign expenditures to the Citizens United case and the declaring of unconstitutionality of the McCain-Feingold laws I pointed there. And then, of course, interesting to point out that you might see if you see this on Facebook when you're going, that's what I put it, is these independent advertisements. There's no restriction on them. These are done by PACs, super PACs, and 527 groups. These are the IRS code 527. And I point out one of the most prominent ones in this election cycle are the Lincoln Project, which are conservatives against Trump, and they've been airing a series of highly provocative ads against the Trump administration and Republican candidates in this election cycle, and very well done ads, I might add, in terms of the quality of their production. But they have been effective at raising the president's ire, and but this is just the latest example of that. We saw in the 2004 election, Veterans for the Truth attacking then Democratic presidential John Kerry over his Vietnam War record, which he was running as a recipient of the various military awards, and these Veterans for Truth objected to that in set of misleading ads, and it was seen to be effective against candidate Kerry. So the elections on the ballot. The ballot, as you can see, each state has its own practices. Each state voters elect state, local, and national candidates. And then these are just some examples from ballot forms from years ago. You'll see the one on the right is the Al Gore, George Bush election of 2000. And you'll see that there's local and state elections as well. And of course, this large array of candidates, many American voters, feel overwhelmed. And you'll see particular issues, for instance, now in the state of Texas. In some instances, some states allow you to just vote for all parties' candidates, whatever they are on the ballot. Texas used to have that rule. The Republican-dominated legislature and Governor Abbott recently signed a law that said you have to check each ballot, each candidate for office. They also in most states, have write-ins. So if you don't like any of the candidates, you write in your own name. For instance, I've done that myself. I've voted for myself or voted for friends. And you'll hear over the next few weeks, prominent Republicans who will not want to vote for Joe Biden have already stated that they'll vote for other candidates. So the road to the White House, what you'll see is what we've been witnessing over the last year is starting in February of the election year. You have caucuses and primaries. Caucuses are different than primary elections. The caucuses, if you're a member of a particular party, you simply show up in a room and there's a public vote for a particular candidate, and then they aggregate the votes of the caucuses. Primary elections are not public, but rather are voted on in the same manner that you would go to electoral vote. And these are primaries are done at the state level. The first caucuses is at Ohio. Oh, I'm sorry, at Iowa. The first primary is at New Hampshire. So these two states have an inordinate amount of influence on the selection of the candidate. And then in the primary elections, the selection process is front ended. It is many states have their election on what's called Super Tuesday in the middle of March, and that the primaries in those states select candidates for their respective parties. Now, the thing to remember about a primary is primaries. You run in a primary as a candidate to earn delegates, and these delegates will then vote at a national convention. They're pledged to you. Now, some, depending on the rules, which change for the national parties, some national parties, if you win a majority of the Republican voters, for instance, in that state, it's winner take all. You take all the delegates from that state. Other states, in other circumstances, the rules may split those delegates up for the candidates to then vote for their candidate at the national convention. And so what will happen is that after the end of the primary period, there's a certain amount of delegates you must earn to earn the nomination. Those delegates then will vote at the national convention for that particular delegate. In many instances, it's a foregone conclusion, because as the states go through the caucus and primary process, it becomes known who will have enough delegates at the national convention to win the nomination for that party. Sometimes, of course, you don't have those circumstances, and you will have what's called a brokered election. There'll be the delegates will be, most instances, will be pledged to vote for a particular candidate. The first vote, then of course no candidate will win a majority of the delegates, so you cannot have, you then have, the delegates are then freed to vote for who they want. This hasn't happened for several decades. I believe the last one was 1952. So the Electoral College, when you start talking about the presidential elections, you need to be aware of the Electoral College. The electoral in the United States, based on the notions towards democracy that the founders had, they didn't have a direct popular election for the president. Rather, they had an indirect method of appointing the president, of electing the president, through the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, in effect, is each state is given a set of points, a set of votes to elect the president. These votes are equal to the 2 senators plus the amount of seats they have in the House of Representatives. So, for instance, in Wisconsin, my home state, there are 8 congressional districts, 8 representatives in the federal House, and 2 senators, so they have 10 votes. Most of these votes at the federal level, when there's a presidential election, it's winner take all. You win all the votes, the majority of the votes in the state of Wisconsin for president, and you get all 10 of those votes. Now, literally, when you vote in the American election, you vote for a slate of electors chosen by the particular party, who then go to, in the case of Wisconsin, the state capitol, and cast their votes. So you vote for 10 people in the state of Wisconsin. They go and vote later on in December, and I've seen this happen, in December for president. And then the president, the individual who wins 270 electoral votes, which is the amount needed, the majority of the Electoral College, wins the presidency. not the individual who won the popular vote. So in the case of 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3.6 million, I believe, and but did not win the Electoral College. Similarly, George Bush in 2000 did not win the popular vote, but rather won the Electoral College. And one of the things you'll see that comes up in this election is this issue of the faithless elector. Electors, who are the slate of candidates who actually vote, actually do not have to vote for the popular choice of the state. Curiously enough, this is a constitutional deficiency it's seen now. And in the last election, you saw electors who did not want to vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton for a variety of reasons. And states have been scrambling to try to deal with this issue. They've passed state laws that have required electors to vote in certain ways, subject to a fine. But this is a debate that's ongoing, and in certain instances, highly polarized environments, as we saw in 2016 or 1968, you will see this issue come up. So here's the electoral votes in the current United States, and these electoral votes are really the objective of the various candidates that have been appointed by the nominees of the respective parties in the national conventions. And so you will see in the case of this last election, President Trump has, the Republicans have essentially given up winning the popular vote, but feel that a strategy that they can maximize their support in key states will allow them to win the Electoral College. So we saw both the nominees, President Trump and President Trump and former Vice President Biden, appointed as nominees by their national party conventions. And just be aware that all these political conventions not only appoint the nominee for their particular national candidate, but also set forth a party platform, which is then used as the basis for determining policy in subsequent years. In the United States, party platforms, unlike our system here in Australia, are less important. But the idea is you aggregate interests in this party platform and enable to satisfy various sections of these large parties, and by doing so, you can maximize your vote in the subsequent election. We will see tonight, in fact, there will be a political debate, the last political debate between Joe Biden and President Trump. The last one was quite a shocking affair in terms of the comportment of the candidates. The first televised presidential debate occurred between Nixon and Kennedy and was seen in 1960 and was seen to be an important factor in that election. Kennedy, youthful, articulate on TV. Nixon, if you look at that, you can see it on Facebook, looking sort of sullen. You could see his beard, shadow of beard, and was seen as less desirable by the public. The presidential debates are important because they allow for free circulation of ideas and policies, and they legitimize the opposition. The president cannot use the accoutrements of the incumbency, which President Trump has in fact done this election cycle in violation of American national presidential voting norms, and that's a different issue we can talk about if people are interested in that. For instance, he used the White House during the Republican National Convention. This has never been done before. But the idea of the debates has been to emphasize the importance of individuals' votes and the normative aspect of opposition and the presidency, that there is a policy clash. There's a clash of individuals both equally legitimate in terms of the political system, that individuals have a choice of choosing. And we'll see if that those norms were badly shaken by the first debate this year. We'll hopefully see a revival of that going forward. And again, presidential debates generally don't affect people's the vote. They have had impacts on the margin, however, and in a close election like the 2020 election, they can impact particular states, which in terms of their electoral college, and the national vote. So just as an example, they affect the perception of candidates. 1984 is a good example. Walter Mondale running against Reagan. Reagan was, like Joe Biden and President Trump, was accused of being kind of old and doddering. The first debate, Mondale was effectively able to make Reagan look like he was not effective because of his age. And the second debate, of course, Reagan had the line, I'm not going to exploit my opponent's relative youth and inexperience. I'm not going to use that in a joking manner. And I saw that debate as a young man, and I thought, oh, the election's over. The second thing about debates is that you don't so much win them as lose them. And Biden, of course, tonight is concerned about that issue of losing the debate. He's ahead in the polls. He doesn't want to lose them. And you saw this happen with Michael Dukakis in 1988. And President Obama, the first debate against Mitt Romney in 2012, Obama performed rather badly. And Mitt Romney, in contrast, looked good. And then, of course, within this matrix of affecting perception and losing, campaigns try to control the questions. And again, we've seen this. The most recent device is to deal with the problems of the first debate. There's a mute button that can be used by the moderator in this debate to allow the candidates to speak their positions initially without interruption. And the Trump administration and Trump campaign, as well as President Trump himself, have said this is unfair. And we will see how it works out in this election cycle. So the election of 2020, this is an election that has been capturing the attention of the United States for the last 8 months, running Republican Donald Trump, the incumbent, versus former Vice President Joe Biden, Vice President under President Obama, both well-known candidates. No one is going to be surprised by either their policies, their demeanor, or their presentation. The electorate in this election cycle is deeply polarized, and there's few undecided voters. The election is different in some ways than 2000 earlier elections, but it carries on from the sort of personalized attacks that have occurred in 2016. There is additional use of more racially charged language and tropes by the Trump, particularly by the Trump campaign. At the same time, you see the issue of race, systemic racism, becoming a more prominent aspect of the policy platforms and campaign appeals by the candidates. It is the most expensive in history, as I've said, projected to be $5.2 billion. There is a sophisticated use of internet media in building over the years. This is the most sophisticated use of internet media. There has been, it has been characterized by highly polarized news outlets. That news outlets have been seen as being, particularly in the Trump presidency, Fox News has been associated as part of the Trump's effort to get the message out. The notion of highly polarized, highly politicized news and news outlets. And then, of course, there's been claims of fake news, particularly by the Trump administration and Trump himself. There's, as I mentioned before, there's the Black Lives Matter, and which has been ongoing in their protests against the death of African Americans at the hands of police, which were energized after the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the protests that have erupted, anti-discrimination protests that have erupted across the country. And these protests, of course, have provided both an opportunity for campaigns as well as a liability for campaigns, depending upon how they look at it. President Trump running on a very strong law and order platform, using the protests as a basis, harking back to 1968 in the protests, the anti-Vietnam civil rights protests then, to argue that he should be re-elected president. And then, of course, there's COVID-19. COVID, from a campaign strategy point of view, the Biden campaign really has focused on President Trump's poor response in their eyes to the COVID pandemic. And it's COVID, as President Trump said yesterday in North Carolina, COVID, COVID, COVID. All I hear is about COVID. And the Biden campaign is trying to make this campaign a referendum on that issue. And then there has been increased questions of the integrity of voting systems. President Trump has claimed falsely that the American election is not secure, that it's rigged, that mail-in ballots are fraudulent, and this has been an issue throughout this campaign in ways that it has not been. One, it's been looked at as a political opportunity to restrict the vote of the Democrats, the popular vote of the Democrats in particular states. But secondly, it's also an issue because COVID has increased the use of mail-in and absentee ballots. And so states have logistical problems that they did not have before. There's also tremendous litigation over voting procedures and access. And we could see that even though it's a fundamental right in terms of voting, the actual mechanisms of voting and the access to vote is done state by state. And so there's litigation across states by various parties in pursuit of their political interests to either maximize or decrease the vote, and of course there's been dramatic changes because of COVID. So the Professor Lovett of Loyola Law School has logged 250 cases filed about voting across the states and in federal court, and we will see more of these. And of course, that's one of the arguments that's been used by President Trump to proceed forward with the nomination of Justice of Amy Barrett, judicial nominee Amy Barrett to the Supreme Court, that they're going to need the Supreme Court to decide some of these issues. Again, most of those issues occur under state law at this time. Then there's issues of paradoxically or sort of tragically, whether the president will respect the ballot if he loses. This is a dramatic departure from American democratic norms, and we'll see what will happen after the election. But there is increased concern that because of the president's own statements that he will not respect the ballot, and there is, of course, the subsequent or consequent potential that there could be violence on behalf of his supporters in the event he loses. Of course, Trump said in 2016 that likewise he wouldn't respect the ballot if he lost, but of course he won, so it wasn't an issue at that time. There's also the issue of cyber attacks. It has been shown that the Russians interfered with the 2016 elections. That sort of dispute can be subject to hours of commentary itself, but there is an increased concern of foreign influence in the American election. Most recently, Iran and Russia have been fingered by by the FBI. However, China has also been accused of seeking to intervene or interfere with these elections. And these interferences are cyber attacks through social media agitation and other techniques. And they involve information and disinformation. And so one of the things I'm particularly interested in is this recent publicity over Hunter Biden's alleged laptop in these emails that implicate former Vice President Biden in unseemly corrupt activities related to his son in the Ukraine. Whether or not these smell like, and they seem to me to have a particular aspect of foreign interference, I don't want to take a position or judge that. I'm just looking at that as an example of, and the FBI is now looking at it as an example of potential interference. It may in fact be Hunter Biden's laptop, and we'll see. But this, of course, will come up in the debate, and it has come up in the political campaigns. And the idea is it will influence the respective candidates' positions and voters' perceptions of their character. So, what about the campaign itself? Well, the campaign has been characterized by a small but steady lead for Joe Biden. And as you can see from this graph from the Financial Times, President Trump has, except in a few polls, has never held either a majority of people satisfied with the job he's done, as well as for his as a majority of the preferred candidate. And so you can see, and this lead that Biden has had nationally and across various battleground states has firmed and slightly increased over since the last debate. President Trump, from the polls, didn't do himself any favors in the last debate, and I think he hopes to reverse it in this debate. But of course, this lead, small but steady lead, was also held by Hillary Clinton. And so the Democrats are faced with this conundrum. They have this lead that looks like they're going to win the White House, as they thought in 2016, only to see it taken from them in their eyes by the Electoral College. And here's the map, the electoral map from 2016, and you can see that the states, the state of Wisconsin, if you look at the blue state, that's Minnesota, number 10 electoral votes. Wisconsin went Republican, traditionally more of a Democratic state. Michigan, next door, 16 Republican, and Ohio, 18 and 20 votes there for Pennsylvania, below the 29 votes for New York. These states gave President Trump the election, and they are considered battleground states. These states have Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio and Pennsylvania had more often gone Democratic. Ohio was more often gone Republican, but those states, because President Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by very small margins, Michigan by 10,000 votes, Wisconsin by 23, Pennsylvania by 84, or I think 80. These states swung the election in favor of President Trump. So this, what's the same? So President Hillary Clinton moving ahead in the polls, and in fact, these ahead in the polls, but nonetheless still lost in the Electoral College. So what's the same? Well, the similarities of the 2006 campaign are there's very enthusiastic supporters for the GOP, and there's less enthusiasm for former Vice President Biden. This is similar. The polls are tight in those battleground states. The former Vice President Biden holds a national lead in the polls, as that chart showed. However, in particular battleground states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, some of these other states that would be subject to a contestation over their electoral votes are much closer. Wisconsin, 6%, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, smaller than that. The electorate is highly polarized. It's polarized both in terms of party, it's polarized in terms of attitudes towards certain issues like abortion, gender issues. These issues are, the polarization, if not from 2016, is actually deeper, more entrenched. It's also the same in terms of turnout. Turnout will be important. The campaigns that can better turn out their voters will have a decided advantage in the election. It's basically the same in the sense that there are solid states and battleground states that are essentially the same. As I said, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, these states are essentially the same. The difference between this election and the 2006 election is there are more battleground states because of the unpopularity of President Trump in certain states. For instance, Georgia is now a toss-up state, whereas it was solidly in the Republican camp in 2016. And there continues to be an urban-rural split within the electorate. And then finally, not on this slide, is that the Republicans seem to be better organized in terms of their internet strategy and their registration strategies than the Democrats. What's different in 2020? Well, Hillary Clinton was not well liked. And the difference from the Democratic's point of view is that Biden is well liked. Biden's a known commodity. Clinton was a known commodity. Clinton was a known commodity that was not well liked. Biden was well liked. The next notion that's different is that, I think that's different, is Trump has a record to run on, and this record is mixed. And so he must defend it. In this election, value issues are more important than they were in 2016. These norms, how you treat people, these sorts of issues have become more important. President Trump's Twitter feed, how he approaches his political opponents, etc. Of course, COVID and Black Lives Matters, both those issues, the big sort of elephants in the room for this election, and of course the Biden campaign's running on that. Democrats are more excited than they were in 2016. They're not as enthusiastic about Biden as the Republicans are against Trump, but nonetheless, they're more excited, and that should play in to the election, the turnout of this election. And then Trump has, because of his record, he has less favorability rating than in 2016, and the major demographics have shifted in this election. They are less solid, more fluid, based on the polls. So, on one hand, you see a very solid electorate. You said the GOP very much behind, but you see groups of voters both within the parties but outside of the parties in the independent electorate who have switched to, who are up for grabs, particularly women in this election, suburban women, and you see candidates making their appeals to suburban women and the elderly vote, which Trump overwhelmingly took in 2016, and now, for a variety of reasons, he is behind on. And then there are fewer undecided voters. So unlike 2016, where voters made up their mind in the polling booth, you have fewer votes, fewer voters who say that they will change their mind or can be undecided. And then finally, there are not as strong third-party candidates. And of course, this issue relates to the issue of if your polls are wrong, people could vote to a third-party candidate. And there were third-party candidates that siphoned a lot of votes away from the candidates. and they just aren't on the ballot this year. Therefore, presumably there will be less swing from the major candidates because there's less opportunity for people to vote for third-party candidates. Here's the Electoral College now from Real Clear Politics. You can see of the states that are either solidly Biden or leaning Democratic, there are 232 states versus Trump, 125 states. And you can see the election will be won or lost in these toss-up states, these would be battlegrounds for this particularly election. And as you can see, the most notable thing is the extension of battleground states has widened. Texas, been solidly Republican, now is considered a toss-up in the presidential election. Georgia, similarly North Carolina. But these elections, the election 181 Electoral College votes up for grabs. You will see the campaigns focusing their attention on these particular states, and the battleground states, or these toss-up states, I've just laid them out for you. These in these states and in these smaller set of states, Biden has a small but steady margin of winning these states. And so when you're watching the election, you need to pay attention to where Florida's going, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Arizona, and Wisconsin. Again, if you just look at the way the votes turn out, 232 electoral votes. If 270 to win, the Republicans, President Trump needs to win all of these states. Can maybe afford to lose one or two, but he needs to win all of these Electoral College wood states. And he is trailing in these states. Again, at this time, there's still a couple of weeks to go, but these those four of those states will put him over Biden over the top. And as you can see in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and in Wisconsin, the lead is above the margin of error in those polls. But again, we will see what happens in the particular circumstances. So finally, I love elections. I love voting in elections. I love the horse race aspect of elections. I love the policy aspect of elections. I love the notion that elections are an input of the citizenry within the power shifts to where it rightly should be in the hands of the electorate and in the hands of the citizens. And in that aspect, the process that's going on in the United States and across countries in terms of voting is actually historically a rare event over the last 300 years. And it is a fragile event in an era of, unlike the triumph of democratic liberal democracy after the end of the Cold War, we're in a period of creeping authoritarian. And the right to vote in a free and fair election is crucial to the maintenance of democratic rule and the inscription to shared rules, shared values related to how those elections are conducted. And you see the American polity, one of the oldest democratic systems, under siege at this point, under threat because of the lack of subscription to these norms and changing in the political disputes and turmoil that's going on. So we'll see how well democratic rule and voting manages these issues, which are not unique to our age, but are unique to many ages. As far as the election itself, it's curiously enough, despite all the dramatic events, the electorate in the United States at the presidential level has been relatively stable. That the preferences by likely voters, by registered voters, have been not moved dramatically. If they've moved anyway, they've moved in the slight favor of Vice President Biden. But despite COVID, despite Black Lives Matter, there hasn't been significant change. In this election, unlike 2016, there's fewer undecided voters. And so turnout becomes more important. So if you have undecided voters, the recent polls suggest 5% are undecided. This, even if it breaks towards President Trump, those 5%, in many states, that will not be enough to potentially bring him over the top. That being said, you never know how people are going to vote. And as we've seen, the polls are just simply wrong in 2016. And polling data, while pollsters have attempted to deal with this problem at the state level, they're still subject to error as a human activity. And we'll see how correct they are, how much better they've done in their position. The top battleground states, as I've said in this presentation, remain crucial. That this election will go down to a handful of votes for the Electoral College votes. Whether that offends democratic principles in terms of national majoritarian politics is something that we can comment on a later time. But the battleground states, the candidates' focus is on states like my home state of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida. And you'll see the candidates going to those battleground states. They won't be going to California, for example, or Wyoming. Whether the appointment of Judge Barrett to the Supreme Court will have any impact on the debate on the election remains to be seen. She's been on track to be appointed after her nomination. She's passed committee. There'll be a full vote of the Senate, and we'll see whether the political calculation of moving forward with this nomination will help the presidential campaign and Republican candidates down ticket. It seems to have had a positive impact on Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee from South Carolina, who's in a very tight race with the Democratic challenger in South Carolina. And finally, as in most elections in the United States, turnout will probably decide this election. Turnout done by state, the organizational capacities of the elections, of the parties to get the vote out. And of course, this turnout is affected by COVID. More mail-in ballots, fewer polling sites in many states because of COVID, a concern by voters about catching COVID if they have to vote in person. So these will impact the election. So that's all I have to say, and I look forward to hearing from people on this very important and interesting election in the United States. So have a good day, and thank you.